Sometimes the safest place in the world is the home built by the person everyone else overlooked. Long before anyone called her a hero, Emily Carter was simply the quiet Omega who lived alone at the edge of Silverpine Coast, where the Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath gray skies and weathered cliffs. The people in town rarely noticed her unless they needed herbs for a fever, blankets for an elderly neighbor, or someone willing to mend a broken fence without asking for anything in return. Kindness was the only wealth Emily had ever possessed, and in a world that admired strength above compassion, it rarely earned respect. By late afternoon, every television station across Maine carried the same warning. Hurricane Celeste had changed course overnight. Winds were expected to exceed 90 miles per hour before sunset, with storm surge flooding low coastal roads and entire neighborhoods ordered to evacuate immediately. Families hurried to reinforce windows with plywood, grocery shelves emptied within hours, and emergency sirens echoed across the shoreline. Members of the Silverpine Pack gathered inside the reinforced community shelter built beneath the old lodge, believing thick concrete walls would protect them from whatever nature unleashed. Emily stood outside carrying a small crate filled with medical supplies she had collected for anyone who might need them. Before she could step through the heavy steel entrance, Beta Mason blocked her path with one arm. His expression remained calm, but his eyes held the familiar dismissal she had known since childhood. "We only have enough room for essential members," he said. "You'll be safer at your cabin." Emily knew it wasn't true. Her cabin sat nearly half a mile closer to the cliffs than the shelter itself. The old wooden house had survived decades of harsh winters, but hurricanes were different. She looked past Mason and saw healthy warriors, influential families, and respected elders already finding places inside. No one argued on her behalf. No one even met her eyes. She simply nodded, tightened her raincoat, and turned away before anyone could mistake her silence for pleading. The first heavy drops struck the gravel road before she reached her truck. By the time she pulled onto the narrow coastal highway, rain hammered the windshield so fiercely the world beyond the glass dissolved into shifting shadows. Pine trees bent violently beneath screaming gusts, road signs trembled, and the ocean had transformed into a wall of dark water crashing against jagged rocks with relentless force. Emily gripped the steering wheel tighter, whispering to herself that she only needed to make it home before the bridge flooded. 25 minutes later, she stepped inside her small cabin, grateful the lights still worked despite the storm. She lit every lantern she owned anyway. Experience had taught her electricity never lasted long during hurricanes. As thunder rolled across the coastline and windows rattled under the pressure of the wind, she stacked blankets near the fireplace, brewed hot tea, and prepared herself for a long, lonely night. Then, just as the clock reached 8:23, a faint scratching sound echoed against the front porch. At first she thought it was another loose branch carried by the wind. But the sound came again, slower this time, deliberate, followed by another, and another. Emily walked carefully toward the door, her heartbeat quickening as 11 distinct silhouettes slowly emerged beyond the rain-soaked glass, waiting silently beneath the storm. Emily did not open the door immediately. Years of living alone had taught her that fear often arrived wearing the face of urgency. She rested one hand on the worn brass handle while the storm howled around the cabin, studying the shapes beyond the fogged glass. 11 wolves stood huddled together on her porch. Their coats were soaked from hours beneath the relentless rain. Some leaned heavily against one another, exhausted by the wind. One smaller gray wolf shivered so violently it could barely remain standing. Near the back stood an enormous black wolf unlike any Emily had ever seen. His broad shoulders towered above the others, yet he remained perfectly still despite the hurricane raging around him. His golden eyes never left hers. There was no growling, no pacing, only quiet patience, as though he understood the decision she was struggling to make. Emily remembered every warning she had ever heard. Rogue wolves were unpredictable. Wild packs sometimes crossed territorial boundaries during disasters. Bringing strangers into one's home could lead to exile from the Silverpine Pack if discovered. Beta Mason had repeated those rules often enough that every Omega knew them by heart. But another gust slammed against the cabin, rattling every window. The smallest wolf stumbled sideways, nearly collapsing as icy rain swept across the porch. Emily closed her eyes for only a second. Then she unlocked the deadbolt. The old wooden door swung inward, allowing warmth from the fireplace to spill into the darkness. None of the wolves rushed forward. Instead, they hesitated, almost as if waiting for permission. Emily stepped backward and quietly said, "Come inside. You are safe here." One after another, the wolves crossed the threshold. Water dripped onto the worn pine floor as they carefully avoided furniture, moving with surprising discipline for frightened animals. Emily quickly spread old quilts across the floor beside the fireplace before adding more logs to the flames. Heat slowly filled the small cabin. The little gray wolf curled beside the fire almost immediately, letting out a long breath that sounded more like relief than exhaustion. Another wolf limped noticeably, favoring one front leg. Emily disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying clean towels, a bucket of warm water, and the small wooden box containing every medical supply she owned. She worked exactly as she always had, speaking softly while cleaning mud from tired paws, checking for splinters, wrapping minor cuts with fresh bandages, and gently brushing tangled fur free of salt and debris carried by the storm. She expected nervous movements or frightened reactions, yet every wolf remained remarkably calm beneath her touch. It was as though they recognized compassion long before trust. Only the great black wolf refused treatment. He remained near the doorway, watching every movement inside the cabin with quiet vigilance. Rainwater still dripped from his dark coat, but he seemed completely unconcerned with himself. Instead, each time Emily approached another injured wolf, his gaze followed her carefully. There was something unsettling about those eyes. Not frightening, but deeply intelligent. She found herself speaking to him without thinking. "You must have protected them all the way here," she whispered while placing another blanket near the fire. "You can rest now." The black wolf blinked once, but did not move. Outside, the wind screamed louder than before. A tree crashed somewhere beyond the cabin, shaking the ground beneath the foundation. The lights flickered once, twice, then vanished completely. Darkness swallowed the room until the fire became the only source of light, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Emily lit 2 oil lanterns and placed them carefully around the cabin. As the warm glow settled over the room, she noticed something that made her pause. Every one of the 11 wolves had relaxed enough to close their eyes except the black wolf. He remained awake, sitting silently between the front door and the fireplace, guarding not himself, but her. The hours drifted forward beneath the endless roar of the hurricane, yet inside the little cabin a different world slowly emerged. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with welcome warmth while rain continued to strike the roof like thousands of tiny pebbles. Emily moved quietly from one wolf to another, checking fresh bandages, placing another log into the fireplace, and offering bowls of clean water whenever one of them stirred awake. She had stopped thinking about whether she was breaking pack law. At some point during the evening, these frightened animals had simply become living souls depending on her. The smallest gray wolf eventually found enough courage to rest its head against her knee. Emily smiled and gently scratched behind its ears. "You are much braver than you think," she whispered. The young wolf closed its eyes almost immediately, as though no one had ever spoken to it with such kindness before. Across the room, the great black wolf remained where he had been since entering the cabin. He had not accepted food. He had not approached the fire. Instead, he continued watching every detail around him. Emily noticed that each time another wolf shifted in discomfort, his ears lifted first. Each unfamiliar sound outside drew his attention before anyone else reacted. He was not merely resting with the group. He was protecting them. The realization settled quietly inside her heart. Whatever had driven these wolves into the storm, this one had carried responsibility for every life inside her home. She filled another kettle and placed it over the fire before walking toward him with slow, careful steps. "You cannot keep watching everyone forever," she said gently. "Even the strongest get tired." The black wolf remained perfectly still until she stopped an arm's length away. Only then did he lower his head ever so slightly. Emily noticed a long scrape hidden beneath the wet fur along his shoulder, one she had missed earlier in the dim light. It was not severe, but it clearly needed cleaning. She held up a folded towel and warm water. "May I?" For several long seconds nothing happened. Then, almost unbelievably, The enormous wolf took one slow step toward her. Emily released the breath she had not realized she was holding. She carefully cleaned away mud and salt water while speaking in the same calm voice she used with frightened children from the nearby town whenever storms knocked out power. "You kept them alive," she murmured. "That must have been exhausting." The wolf never flinched beneath her touch. Instead, his golden eyes softened in a way she could not explain. They did not resemble the gaze of a wild predator. They carried patience, restraint, and something remarkably close to gratitude. Suddenly, a loud pounding echoed from outside the cabin. Every wolf lifted its head at once. The peaceful silence vanished instantly. Another heavy knock followed, louder than before, nearly lost beneath the wind. Emily's heart skipped. No one should have been traveling during the height of the hurricane. She slowly stood and glanced through the front window, but rain covered the glass too heavily to see more than blurred lantern light outside. Then a familiar voice rose through the storm. "Emily Carter. Open this door immediately." It was Beta Mason. Behind him, she could make out several moving shadows carrying flashlights. Her stomach tightened. They had found the cabin. Before she could reach the entrance, every wolf had silently risen to its feet. None of them growled. None of them moved toward the door. They simply stood together, waiting. The black wolf stepped forward without making a sound and positioned himself between Emily and the entrance. His broad frame blocked the doorway completely. Emily looked at him in surprise, and for the briefest moment, those steady golden eyes seemed to tell her exactly one thing. "You protected us. Now let me protect you." Emily placed one trembling hand against the black wolf's shoulder, not to stop him, but to reassure herself that he was real. His thick coat was still damp from the storm, yet his steady breathing carried an unexpected calm that slowly settled her racing heart. Outside, the pounding returned, stronger than before, followed by the sharp beam of several flashlights cutting through the sheets of rain. Beta Mason's voice echoed across the porch once again. "Emily, we know you are inside. Open the door. We are conducting a safety inspection." Emily understood immediately that this was no ordinary visit. Nobody risked traveling through a hurricane to perform inspections. Someone had reported seeing wolves near her cabin. She looked around the room. The smaller wolves instinctively moved closer together near the fireplace, while the older ones quietly formed a loose circle around them. Not one of them showed panic. Their discipline was almost impossible to explain. They behaved less like frightened animals and more like trained guardians following silent commands. Emily drew a slow breath before walking toward the entrance. The black wolf remained beside her, matching every step without making a sound. When she reached the door, she stopped. "Please stay back," she whispered softly without looking at him. "I do not want anyone getting hurt." She unlocked the door only enough to open it a few inches. Rain immediately rushed inside, carried by powerful gusts of wind that extinguished one of the lanterns. Beta Mason stood beneath the heavy, waterproof coat with 4-pack warriors behind him, each holding bright flashlights that swept across the dark interior. His expression hardened the moment he saw Emily standing alone in the doorway. "We tracked fresh paw prints leading here," he said. "Several large wolves entered this property less than an hour ago." Emily remained composed despite the knot tightening in her stomach. "The storm has driven many animals away from the forest." Mason narrowed his eyes. "Do not insult my intelligence. These were wolf tracks." He leaned slightly forward, trying to see beyond her shoulder. Emily shifted just enough to block his view without making the movement obvious. The wind howled between them, carrying the scent of salt water and broken pine. One of the younger warriors spoke quietly. "Beta, the bridge is beginning to flood. We should head back before we get trapped." Mason ignored him completely. His attention never left Emily. "If you are hiding rogue wolves, you are violating pack law. Step aside so we can search the cabin." Emily felt fear rise inside her, but another feeling rose beside it. Resolve. Throughout her life, she had stepped aside whenever others demanded it. She had accepted insults, rejection, and loneliness because resisting always seemed pointless. Yet tonight was different. 11 lives rested behind her. She straightened her shoulders. "There is no emergency inside this house," she answered calmly. "Only living creatures trying to survive the same storm as everyone else." Mason's jaw tightened. "You would choose strangers over your own pack?" Emily looked directly into his eyes for perhaps the first time since they had known each other. Kindness does not ask where someone comes from before offering shelter. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Rain continued pouring from the roof while thunder rolled across the dark coastline. Then, from somewhere deep inside the cabin, came the soft cry of the little gray wolf awakening from sleep. Every warrior outside heard it. Mason slowly turned his flashlight toward the narrow opening in the door. Before the beam could slip past Emily, an enormous shadow silently stepped forward behind her. The black wolf did not bare his teeth or make a threatening sound. He simply stood tall enough for his silhouette to fill the warm light of the cabin, his golden eyes meeting Mason's without the slightest hint of fear. In that single silent moment, every man on the porch forgot about the storm because they suddenly realized they were standing in the presence of something they had never encountered before. The rain continued to pour between the porch and the darkness beyond, but no one moved. Beta Mason stared at the enormous black wolf, his confident posture replaced by cautious uncertainty. Even the warriors behind him lowered their flashlights without realizing they had done so. There was something impossible to ignore about the animal before them. It was not simply his extraordinary size or the calm strength radiating from his broad frame. It was the quiet authority in his golden eyes, an ancient confidence that belonged to no ordinary wolf. Emily could feel it too. Standing only inches away, she sensed an invisible weight filling the little cabin, as though the storm itself had paused to acknowledge the silent guardian at her side. Mason finally cleared his throat. That wolf belongs nowhere near this pack. His voice remained firm, but it lacked the certainty it had carried only moments earlier. Emily folded her arms against the cold wind blowing through the doorway. Tonight, he belongs somewhere warm. Mason frowned. You cannot possibly know what you are protecting. Emily answered without hesitation. I know exactly what I am protecting. Living creatures that would have frozen outside if I had closed my door. One of the younger warriors shifted uneasily. He looked at the black wolf, then back toward the flooded road disappearing beneath sheets of rain. Beta, he said quietly, the weather is getting worse. Emergency services already closed the coastal highway. We should leave before the trees come down. Mason remained silent. His pride battled against the growing realization that continuing this confrontation served no purpose. Then another clap of thunder shook the ground beneath their feet. A nearby utility pole groaned loudly before vanishing into darkness as another neighborhood lost power. The only light now came from Emily's lanterns glowing softly behind the doorway. Mason looked at her one final time. When daylight comes, we will return. Emily nodded calmly. If the storm allows it. He turned without another word. The warriors followed him toward their trucks, their boots splashing through rising water as flashlights gradually disappeared into the rain. Emily remained standing until the engines faded into the distance. Only then did she quietly close the heavy wooden door and slide the deadbolt back into place. The cabin became peaceful once again. She released a long breath she had been holding since the first knock. Turning around, she found every wolf watching her. The little gray wolf approached first, gently brushing against her leg before returning to the warmth of the fireplace. The others slowly relaxed, settling back onto the quilts as though they understood the danger had passed. Only the great black wolf remained standing. Emily smiled tiredly. Looks like we all survived another difficult moment. She walked toward the kitchen and poured fresh water into several bowls before placing a pot of homemade vegetable stew over the fire. The rich aroma of carrots, potatoes, onions, and herbs soon filled the cabin. She laughed softly at herself. I only planned enough for one person tonight. Looking around at her unexpected guests, she reached for more bread from the pantry. I suppose we will all have to share. To her surprise, none of the wolves rushed toward the food. They waited patiently until she finished placing every bowl on the floor. Only after she quietly stepped back did they begin eating, allowing the smallest wolves to approach first. Emily watched in amazement. Such order could not be explained by instinct alone. Someone had taught them discipline. Someone had taught them to protect the weak before themselves. Her eyes slowly drifted toward the black wolf. He still had not touched his own food. Instead, he calmly watched the others eat first, exactly as a leader might quietly ensure every member of his family was safe before thinking of himself. Emily knelt beside his untouched. Bull, and gently pushed it closer. Leaders need strength too, she whispered. For the first time that night, the black wolf lowered his head and accepted the meal. As the firelight reflected inside his golden eyes, Emily noticed something extraordinary. Gratitude was no longer the only emotion shining there. It was recognition, as though somewhere deep behind those ancient eyes, he had begun remembering someone he had been searching for far longer than either of them could possibly imagine. The storm reached its fiercest point shortly after midnight. The cabin trembled beneath powerful winds that swept across the rocky coastline, yet inside, the warmth of the fireplace refused to surrender. Emily added another log to the flames before wrapping herself in an old wool blanket and settling into the rocking chair beside the hearth. She intended only to rest her eyes for a few minutes. Instead, exhaustion quietly carried her into sleep. Outside, rain continued to flood the forest trails while towering pines bent beneath relentless gusts. Deep within the darkness surrounding the cabin, unseen eyes watched the little house glowing like a lantern against the storm. Yet none approached. Something about the presence guarding that home warned every wandering predator to keep its distance. Hours passed. The smaller wolves slept peacefully for the first time in days. Their breathing grew steady beneath the quilts Emily had carefully arranged around the fireplace. The black wolf remained awake. He slowly rose from his place near the entrance and walked through the cabin with measured, silent steps. He paused beside each member of the small group, checking them one by one before finally turning toward the sleeping woman. Emily rested with one hand hanging loosely beside the chair, her face illuminated by the gentle orange light of the fire. Strands of chestnut hair had fallen across her cheek, and despite everything that had happened that evening, her expression remained peaceful. The great wolf lowered his head slightly, studying her with quiet wonder. Never in his long life had anyone offered shelter without first asking what they might gain in return. Never had someone opened a door during the deadliest storm of the year simply because another living soul needed warmth. She had expected nothing. She had demanded nothing. The black wolf carefully moved closer until he stood beside the rocking chair. After a brief hesitation, he nudged another folded blanket lying on the nearby sofa with his nose. The blanket slipped onto the floor. He caught it gently between his teeth, lifted it, and with slow, careful movements draped it across Emily's shoulders as she slept. She stirred only slightly, unconsciously pulling the blanket closer before settling comfortably once again. The wolf stepped back into the shadows. At that exact moment, the little gray wolf opened sleepy eyes and quietly watched everything. One after another, the remaining wolves awakened just enough to witness what had happened. None made a sound. They simply looked toward the black wolf with unmistakable respect before peacefully lowering their heads once again. It was a silent acknowledgement of leadership that needed no words. Just before dawn, the wind finally began to weaken. Rain softened into a steady drizzle, and the violent roar outside slowly faded into distant waves crashing against the cliffs. Pale morning light filtered through the windows, revealing a coastline transformed by the hurricane. Fallen branches covered the yard. Sections of the wooden fence had disappeared, and floodwater still surrounded parts of the gravel driveway. Emily slowly opened her eyes, surprised to find the extra blanket wrapped securely around her shoulders. She smiled to herself, assuming she must have covered herself during the night without remembering. Rising from the chair, she stretched and looked around the cabin. Every wolf was already awake. They watched her quietly with calm, attentive eyes, as though waiting for whatever came next. She laughed softly. "Good morning, everyone." Her cheerful greeting somehow felt completely natural. She prepared fresh water and the last of her bread, dividing every piece into equal portions before serving the smallest wolves first. Once again, none of the larger wolves ate until the younger ones had finished. Emily shook her head in amazement. "You really do have someone looking after all of you." Her eyes met the golden gaze of the great black wolf standing near the window. Sunlight finally broke through the retreating clouds, casting a brilliant beam across his dark coat. For the briefest instant, strange silver markings shimmered beneath his damp fur before disappearing again. So quickly Emily wondered if exhaustion had simply played tricks on her eyes. The black wolf quietly turned toward the clearing sky, his expression thoughtful, almost knowing. Somewhere beyond the broken clouds, Something ancient had begun to awaken, and neither of them realized that by the time another sunset arrived, the secrets hidden beneath that quiet morning would change both of their lives forever. By mid-morning, the sky above Silverpine Coast had turned a brilliant shade of blue, as though the hurricane had never existed. Sunlight glistened across rain-soaked branches, and the salty breeze carried the clean scent of the Atlantic instead of destruction. Emily stepped onto the porch with a basket in her hands, quietly surveying the damage. Sections of the fence had collapsed, driftwood covered part of the yard, and several flower beds had disappeared beneath layers of sand washed inland by the storm's surge. It would take weeks to repair everything, yet she felt strangely grateful simply to see the sun again. Behind her, the 11 wolves followed one by one, stretching beneath the warm morning light. The smaller gray wolf bounded happily across the grass before stopping to watch butterflies dancing above the wildflowers that somehow had survived the storm. Emily smiled at the unexpected sight. "Looks like someone already forgot yesterday was frightening," she laughed softly. The black wolf stepped onto the porch last. In daylight, he appeared even more remarkable. His dark coat shimmered with subtle silver beneath the sun, while his golden eyes quietly studied every corner of the property. He paused beside Emily, gazing toward the forest as though listening to something carried on the wind. Emily noticed the scrape on his shoulder looked far better than it had the night before. "You heal quickly," she whispered, with quiet satisfaction. "That is a blessing." She gathered a few remaining bandages and carefully checked the other wolves one final time. Every minor injury had improved overnight. Relief settled warmly inside her chest. Whatever happened next, at least they would leave healthier than when they arrived. Suddenly, the distant sound of engines echoed along the flooded road. Emily looked toward the trees and saw several dark vehicles slowly approaching the cabin. They were unlike the pickup trucks belonging to the Silverpine pack. These vehicles were larger, black, and marked with an unfamiliar silver crest resembling a crowned wolf beneath a full moon. They stopped several yards away without a single horn or shouted command. A dozen men and women stepped out wearing matching dark coats. Their movements were calm, disciplined, and remarkably respectful. None carried visible weapons. None rushed toward the house. Instead, they quietly formed two orderly lines facing the porch. Emily frowned in confusion. "Who are they?" she whispered. Before anyone answered, every wolf beside her became perfectly still. The little gray wolf lowered its head. The older wolves did the same. One after another, all 10 turned toward the great black wolf standing beside Emily. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Emily looked from the visitors to the wolves, unable to understand what was happening. Then the strangers performed exactly the same gesture. Every man and woman placed one hand over the center of the chest before lowering their heads with unmistakable respect. The oldest among them, a silver-haired gentleman with kind blue eyes, slowly stepped forward until he reached the foot of the porch stairs. He never looked at Emily first. His gaze remained fixed upon the great black wolf. His voice carried both relief and reverence. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "we have searched every coastal territory since the storm began. We are grateful beyond words that you are safe." Emily blinked, certain she had misunderstood. "Your Majesty." The words echoed inside her mind as she slowly turned toward the black wolf standing only inches away. He met her eyes with the same calm expression he had worn since the moment she opened her door the previous night. Then something extraordinary happened. Warm silver light began flowing gently beneath his dark fur, shimmering brighter with every heartbeat. The air itself seemed to grow still. Even the breeze stopped moving through the trees. Emily could only stand frozen in wonder as the quiet guardian she had welcomed into her little cabin prepared to reveal the truth he had hidden from the world. Emily could not breathe. The silver light surrounding the great black wolf shimmered like moonlight reflected across a calm ocean, growing brighter with each passing heartbeat. The air itself seemed to hum with quiet energy, not frightening but ancient, as though the forest had been waiting countless years for this very moment. Every wolf lowered its head even farther, remaining perfectly still. The visitors at the foot of the porch did the same, their eyes filled with profound respect. Emily instinctively stepped backward, not because she was afraid, but because she suddenly realized she was witnessing something far beyond ordinary understanding. The black wolf slowly lifted his head toward the clear morning sky. The silver radiance wrapped gently around him before fading as gracefully as it had appeared. When the light disappeared, the enormous wolf was gone. Standing where he had been only seconds before was a tall man dressed in dark clothing that seemed untouched by the storm. His hair was as black as midnight, falling neatly to his shoulders, while his striking golden eyes were exactly the same ones that had quietly watched over the cabin throughout the night. His broad shoulders carried natural authority without arrogance, and despite everything Emily had just witnessed, the first thing she noticed was not his strength. It was the quiet kindness in his expression as he looked directly at her. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence between them held every shared moment from the previous night. The warm fire, the carefully wrapped bandages, the bowl of stew placed gently before him, the blanket she believed she had imagined, the promise of safety offered without hesitation. Finally, the silver-haired gentleman approached the porch and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, King Adrian Blackwood, the Royal Council has feared the worst since communication with your escort was lost during the hurricane. Every territory has been searching for you." Adrian gave a small nod, but never took his eyes off Emily. "The storm separated us near the northern cliffs," he answered calmly. His voice was deep, steady, and unexpectedly gentle. Without this woman's compassion, many lives would have been lost to the cold before dawn. The council members turned toward Emily with expressions of genuine gratitude. She immediately shook her head. "I only opened my door," she said softly. "Anyone would have done the same." Adrian smiled, and for the first time that morning, warmth reached his eyes. "No," he replied. "Many would have closed it." Emily lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. Throughout her life, she had been dismissed as the weakest member of her pack. No one had ever looked at her with such sincere respect. Adrian slowly stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "You never asked who we were," he said quietly. Emily gave a small smile. "You were cold, tired, and needed help. That was enough." The simple answer seemed to touch everyone standing nearby. Even the older council members exchanged thoughtful glances. Adrian looked toward the 10 remaining wolves. One after another, they also stepped into the same gentle silver light before returning to their human forms. Some appeared young, others older, but every one of them bowed respectfully toward Emily before speaking words of thanks. The smallest gray wolf became a cheerful little boy no older than 8. He shyly approached Emily holding the folded quilt she had wrapped around him during the night. "Thank you for calling me brave," he whispered. "Nobody ever said that before." Emily knelt and smiled warmly. "Because you were." Tears gathered in the child's eyes as he hugged the blanket tightly. Adrian watched the moment in complete silence. In that instant, every lingering doubt disappeared from his heart. The storm had not simply carried him to a safe place. It had led him to the one person who had seen 11 strangers in desperate need and chosen compassion before fear. And deep within the ancient bond carried by Lycan blood, something long dormant quietly awakened, whispering that destiny had finally found its way home. Emily remained kneeling beside the young boy for another quiet moment before slowly rising to her feet. Around her, the people who had entered her home as weary wolves now stood together as a family bound not only by loyalty, but by gratitude. The quilts she had folded, the simple bowls she had filled, the bandages she had wrapped with patient hands, all seemed ordinary to her. Yet in the eyes of those before her, they had become acts of extraordinary kindness. Adrian Blackwood stepped forward until they stood side by side on the porch overlooking the coastline. The sunlight shimmered across the ocean where the hurricane had raged only hours before. Broken branches still covered the yard, but birds had already begun singing again, as though nature itself believed every storm deserved an ending filled with hope. Adrian looked toward the damaged fence surrounding Emily's small property. "You spent the night protecting strangers," he said softly. "Now allow us to return a fraction of what you have given." Without waiting for instructions, members of the royal escort quietly spread across the property. Some cleared fallen trees from the driveway. Others repaired sections of fencing or gathered scattered debris. The young boy carefully replanted flowers that had been buried beneath sand, smiling each time Emily thanked him. She watched the scene unfold in amazement. No one acted because they had been ordered to. They worked because gratitude had inspired them. Emily turned toward Adrian. You do not owe me any of this. He smiled gently. Kindness is never a debt. It is a gift. But gifts have a remarkable way of changing the people who receive them. Just then another vehicle slowly approached along the muddy road. Beta Mason climbed out, stopping abruptly when he saw dozens of respectful royal attendants working around the cabin. His eyes widened as he recognized Adrian standing beside Emily. Before Mason could speak, the silver-haired council member stepped forward. You are in the presence of His Majesty, King Adrian Blackwood. Mason immediately lowered his head, his earlier confidence replaced by stunned silence. Adrian's voice remained calm. Emily Carter showed compassion when she believed we were nothing more than helpless travelers. She offered shelter without asking for names, rank, or reward. Such character deserves honor. Mason slowly looked toward Emily, seeing her in a way he never had before. The quiet Omega he had overlooked possessed a strength no title could create. Emily noticed the embarrassment on his face and simply offered a small, forgiving smile. She had no desire to humiliate anyone. Compassion that demanded revenge was no longer compassion. Adrian noticed her response and admired it even more than her courage during the storm. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the repairs were finished. The little cabin looked stronger than it had before the hurricane arrived. Adrian reached into his coat and removed a small silver medallion engraved with the image of a wolf beneath a full moon. He placed it gently into Emily's hand. This is not a payment, he said. It is an invitation. Whenever you choose, the gates of my kingdom will always open for the woman who reminded a king what true strength looks like. Emily closed her fingers around the medallion, feeling its surprising warmth. She looked from the token to Adrian, then toward the ocean where sunlight danced across calm water. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had believed she was alone in the world. Now she understood that a single decision made with kindness could alter countless lives, including her own. As Adrian and his companions prepared to leave, he met her eyes one final time. No promises needed to be spoken. Some paths did not begin with destiny alone. They began with an open door, a warm fire, and a heart that refused to let fear decide who deserved compassion. And as Emily watched the royal convoy disappear beyond the trees, she realized the greatest miracle had never been discovering that one of the wolves was a king. It was discovering that genuine kindness could be powerful enough to change the course of every life it touched.